Adapted from archaic translation by Robert Chalmers. Jataka number 124. Amba-Jātaka. Toil on, my brother. This story was told by the master while at Jetavana monastery, about a good Brahmin belonging to a noble Shravasti city family who gave his heart to the truth, and, joining the brotherhood, became constant in all duties. Blameless in his attendance on teachers. Scrupulous in the matter of foods and drinks. Zealous in the performance of the duties of the chapter house, bathhouse, and so on. Perfectly punctual in the observance of the 14 major and of the 80 minor disciplines. He used to sweep the monastery, the cells, the enclosures, and the path leading to their monastery, and gave water to thirsty folk. And because of his great goodness folk gave regularly 500 meals a clay to the brethren. And great gain and honor accrued to the monastery, the many prospering for the virtues of one. And one day in the hall of truth, the brethren fell to talking of how that brother's goodness had brought them gain and honor, and filled many lives with joy. Entering the hall, the master asked, and was told, what their talk was about. This is not the first time, brethren, said he, that this brother has been regular in the fulfillment of duties. In days gone by 500 hermits going out to gather fruits were supported on the fruits that his goodness provided. So saying, he told this story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva was born a Brahmin in the north, and, growing up, gave up the world and lived at the head of 500 hermits at the foot of the mountains. In those days, there came a great drought upon the Himalaya country, and everywhere the water was dried up, and painful distress fell upon all beasts. Seeing the poor creatures suffering from thirst, one of the hermits cut down a tree which he hollowed into a trough. And this trough he filled with all the water he could find. In this way he gave the animals to drink. And they came in herds and drank till the hermit had no time left to go and gather fruits for himself. Regardless of his own hunger, he worked away to quench the animals' thirst. Thought they to themselves, so wrapped up is this hermit in ministering to our wants that he leaves himself no time to go in quest of fruits. He must be very hungry. Let us agree that every one of us who comes here to drink must bring such fruits as he can to the hermit. This they agreed to do. Every animal that came bringing mangoes or jambus or bread fruits or the like, till their offerings would have filled 250 wagons. And there was food for the whole 500 hermits with abundance to spare. Seeing this, the Bodhisattva exclaimed, "Thus has one man's goodness been the means of supplying with food all these hermits. Truly, we should always be firm in right doing." So saying, he uttered this stanza. Toil on, my brother. Still in hope stand fast. Nor let your courage flag and tire. Forget not him, who by his grievous past, reaped fruits beyond his heart's desire. Such was the teaching of the great being to the band of hermits. His lesson ended, the master identified the birth by saying, "This brother was the good hermit of those days, and I the hermit's master." Source: adapted from archaic translation by Robert Chalmers. Jataka number 125. Kaṭāhaka-Jātaka. If he, mid strangers. This story was told by the master while at Jetavana monastery, about a boastful brother. The introductory story about him is like what has been already told. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, the Bodhisattva was a rich treasurer, and his wife had him a son. And the same day a female slave in his house gave birth to a boy, and the two children grew up together. And when the rich man's son was being taught to write, The young slave used to go with his young master's tablets and so learned at the same time to write himself. Next he learned 2 or 3 handicrafts, and grew up to be a fair-spoken and handsome young man. And his name was Kaṭāhaka. Being employed as private secretary, he thought to himself, I shall not always be kept at this work. The slightest fault and I shall be beaten, imprisoned, branded, and fed on slaves' food. On the border there lives a merchant, a friend of my master's. Why should I not go to him with a letter from my master, and, passing myself off as my master's son, marry the merchant's daughter and live happily ever afterwards? So he wrote a letter, saying, The bearer of this is my son. It is good that our houses should be united in marriage, and I would have you give your daughter to this my son and keep the young couple near you for the present. As soon as I can conveniently do so, I will come to you. This letter he sealed with his master's private seal, and came to the border merchants with a well-filled purse, handsome dresses, and perfumes and the like. And with a bow he stood before the merchant. Where do you come from? Said the merchant. From Benares. Who is your father? The treasurer of Benares. And what brings you here? This letter will tell you, said Kaṭāhaka, handing it to him. The merchant read the letter and exclaimed, This gives me new life. And in his joy he gave his daughter to Kaṭāhaka and set up the young couple, who lived in great style. But Kaṭāhaka gave himself airs, and used to find fault with the food and the clothes that were brought him, calling them provincial. These misguided provincials, he would say, have no idea of dressing. And as for taste in scents and garlands, they've got none. Missing his slave, the Bodhisattva said, I don't see Kaṭāhaka. Where has he gone? Find him. And off went the Bodhisattva's people in quest of him, and searched far and wide till they found him. Then back they came, without Kaṭāhaka recognizing him, and told the Bodhisattva. This will never do, said the Bodhisattva on hearing the news. I will go and bring him back. So he asked the king's permission, and departed with a great following. And the news spread everywhere that the treasurer was on his way to the borders. Hearing the news, Kaṭāhaka fell to thinking of his course of action. He knew that he was the sole reason of the treasurer's coming, and he saw that to run away now was to destroy all chance of returning. So he decided to go to meet the treasurer, and appease him by acting as a slave towards him as in the old days. Acting on this plan, he made a point of proclaiming in public on all occasions his denial of the sad decay of respect towards parents, which explained itself in children's sitting down to meals with their parents, instead of waiting upon them. When my parents take their meals, said Kaṭāhaka, I hand the plates and dishes, bring the spittoon, and fetch their fans for them. Such is my invariable practice. And he explained carefully a slave's duty to his master, such as bringing the water, and ministering to him when he retired. And having already schooled folk in general, he had said to his father-in-law shortly before the arrival of the Bodhisattva, I hear that my father is coming to see you. You had better make ready to entertain him, while I will go and meet him on the road with a present. Do so, my dear boy, said his father-in-law. So Kaṭāhaka took a magnificent present, and went out with a large group of attendants to meet the Bodhisattva, to whom he handed the present with a low reverence. The Bodhisattva took the present in a kindly way, and at breakfast time made his encampment and retired for the purposes of nature. Stopping his group of attendants, Kaṭāhaka took water and approached the Bodhisattva. Then the young man fell at the Bodhisattva's feet and cried, Oh, sir, I will pay any sum you may require. But do not expose me. "Fear no exposure at my hands," said the Bodhisattva, pleased at his dutiful conduct, and entered into the city, where he was feted with great magnificence. And Kaṭāhaka still acted as his slave. As the treasurer sat at his ease, the border merchant said, "My lord, upon receipt of your letter I duly gave my daughter in marriage to your son." And the treasurer made a suitable reply about his son, in so kindly a way that the merchant was delighted beyond measure. But from that time on the Bodhisattva could not bear the sight of Kaṭāhaka. One day the great being sent for the merchant's daughter and said, "My dear, please look my head over." She did so. And he thanked her for her much-needed services, adding, "And now tell me, my dear, whether my son is a reasonable man in welfare and suffering, and whether you manage to get on well with him. My husband has only one fault. He will find fault with his food. He has always had his faults, my dear. But I will tell you how to stop his tongue. I will tell you a text which you must learn carefully and repeat to your husband when he finds fault again with his food." And he taught her the lines and shortly afterwards set out for Benares. Kaṭāhaka accompanied him part of the way, and took his leave after offering most valuable presents to the treasurer. Dating from the departure of the Bodhisattva, Kaṭāhaka grew prouder and prouder. One day his wife ordered a nice dinner, and began to help him to eat with a spoon, but at the first mouthful Kaṭāhaka began to grumble. On that the merchant's daughter, remembering her lesson, repeated the following stanza. If he amidst strangers far from home talks big, back comes his visitor to spoil it all. Come, eat your dinner then, Kaṭāhaka. Dear me, thought Kaṭāhaka, the treasurer must have informed her of my name, and have told her the whole story. And from that day on he gave himself no more airs, but humbly ate what was set before him, and at his death passed away to fare according to his deeds. His lesson ended, the master identified the birth by saying, "This haughty brother was the Kaṭāhaka of those days, and I the treasurer of Benares." Source: adapted from archaic translation by Robert Chalmers. Jataka number 126. Asilakkhaṇa-Jātaka. Our Manye Fates. This story was told by the master while at Jetavana monastery, about a Brahmin retained by the king of Kosala, because of his power of telling whether swords were lucky or not. We are told that when the king's smiths had forged a sword, this Brahmin could by merely smelling it tell whether it was a lucky one or not. And he made it a rule only to commend the work of those smiths who gave him presents, while he rejected the work of those who did not bribe him. Now a certain smith made a sword and put into the sheath with it some finely ground pepper, and brought it in this state to the king, who at once handed it over to the Brahmin to test. The Brahmin unsheathed the blade and sniffed at it. The pepper got up his nose and made him sneeze, and that so violently that he slit his nose on the edge of the sword. This mishap of the Brahmin came to the brethren's ears, and one day they were talking about it in the hall of truth when the master entered. On learning the subject of their talk, he said, "This is not the first time, brethren, that this Brahmin has slit his nose sniffing swords. The same fate fell upon him in former days." So saying, he told this story of the past. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares, he had in his service a Brahmin who had learnt to tell whether swords were lucky or not, and all came to pass as in the introductory story. And the king called in the surgeons and had him fitted with a false tip to his nose which was cunningly painted for all the world like a real nose. And then the Brahmin resumed his duties again about the king. Now Brahmadatta had no son, only a daughter and a nephew, whom he had brought up under his own eye. And when these two grew up, they fell in love with one another. So the king sent for his counselors, and said to them, "My nephew is heir to the throne. If I give him my daughter to wife, he shall be anointed king." But, on second thoughts, he decided that as in any case his nephew was like a son, he had better marry him to a foreign princess, and give his daughter to a prince of another royal house. For, he thought, this plan would give him more grandchildren and vest in his line the scepters of two several kingdoms. And, after consulting with his counselors, he resolved to separate the two, and they were accordingly made to dwell apart from one another. Now they were 16 years old and very much in love, and the young prince thought of nothing but how to carry off the princess from her father's palace. At last the plan struck him of sending for a wise woman, to whom he gave a pocketful of money. "And what's this for?" said she. Then he told her of his passion, and pleaded the wise woman to convey him to his dear princess. And she promised him success, and said that she would tell the king that his daughter was under the influence of witchcraft. But that, as the demon had possessed her so long that he was off his guard, she would take the princess one day in a carriage to the cemetery with a strong escort under arms. And there in a magic circle lay the princess on a bed with a dead man under it, and with 108 douches of scented water wash the demon out of her. And when on this pretext I bring the princess to the cemetery," continued the wise woman, "mind that you just reach the cemetery before us in your carriage with an armed escort, taking some ground pepper with you. Arrived at the cemetery, you will leave your carriage at the entrance, and send your men to the cemetery grove, while you will yourself go to the top of the mound and lie down as though dead. Then I will come and set up a bed over you on which I will lay the princess. Then will come the time when you must sniff at the pepper till you sneeze 2 or 3 times, and when you sneeze we will leave the princess and take to our heels. On that you and the princess must bathe all over, and you must take her home with you." "Capital," said the prince. "A most excellent means." So away went the wise woman to the king, and he fell in with her idea, as did the princess when it was explained to her. When the day came, the old woman told the princess their job, and said to the guards on the road in order to frighten him, "Listen. Under the bed that I shall set up, there will be a dead man. And that dead man will sneeze. And know well that, so soon as he has sneezed, he will come out from under the bed and seize on the first person he finds. So be prepared, all of you." Now the prince had already got to the place and got under the bed as had been arranged. Next the crone led off the princess and laid her upon the bed, whispering to her not to be afraid. At once the prince sniffed at the pepper and fell in sneezing. And scarce had he begun to sneeze before the wise woman left the princess and with a loud scream was off, quicker than ally of them. Not a man stood his ground. One and all they throw away their arms and bolted for dear life. On this the prince came on and took off the princess to his home, as had been before arranged. And the old woman made her way to the king and told him what had happened. "Well," thought the king, "I always intended her for him, and they've grown up together like ghee in rice porridge." So he didn't fly into a passion, but in course of time made his nephew king of the land, with his daughter as queen wife. Now the new king kept on in his service the Brahmin who used to tell the temper of swords, and one day as he stood in the sun, the false tip to the Brahmin's nose got loose and fell off. And there he stood, hanging his head for very shame. Never mind, laughed the king. "Sneezing is good for some, but bad for others. One sneeze lost you your nose, while I have to thank a sneeze for both my throne and queen." So saying he uttered this stanza. Are many fates this moral show. What brings me welfare, may work you suffering. So spoke the king, and after a life spent in charity and other good works, he passed away to fare according to his deeds. In this way did the master teach the lesson that the world was wrong in thinking things were definitely and absolutely good or bad in all cases alike. Lastly, he identified the birth by saying, the same man that now used to tell whether swords are lucky or not, practiced the same skill in those days. And I was myself the prince who inherited his uncle's kingdom.